My talk today is called Decentralization is a Fetish. Don't worry, the jokes won't get any better, but I'll make few of them when I'm less uncomfortable. This is me. Have written a book called Building with Ethereum, which is about the application layer. So it's not just how do you write good smart contracts, but how do you actually build things on top? How do you build products? And trying to reason about technological decisions that we make in Ethereum by thinking about products and by thinking about user focus. Some of it's about user experience, some of it's about technical decisions that underpin that user experience. This is a talk that comes out from some of the discussions that I have had with people in the process of writing this book. So if it's interesting, then by all means pre-order it on Amazon and send me emails about exactly how I'm wrong. Now, I'll start with a disclaimer. I have no compunction about convincing you guys of anything today. People who work in crypto are committed to decentralization as a basic moral principle. The point here is not to convince you that I'm right. I just want to convince you that I'm not completely crazy. If I can do that, then we can begin to have a conversation about this stuff that I think is super important, central to how our community is structured, central to the products that we build, and also massively under-discussed. Okay, disclaimer over. So the plan is 3 parts. Number 1, you don't want decentralization. Number 2, you shouldn't want it. And number 3, you don't need it. Okay, let's give it a go. You don't want decentralization. Okay. When we talk about decentralization, what do we want decentralization for? Like, what are the reasons why? Has anyone got any properties or things that they like about decentralization that they want to yell out? Okay, cool. So like reliability, like network reliability, great. Yeah. Censorship resistance, that's a big one. It's another big part of it. More accessible to more people, right? Broader accessibility. If you have decentralization, then there's not arbitrary legal frameworks that prevent people from joining in. That seems like a really good benefit. Network reliability, absolutely. Competition and innovation, that's a big one. You decentralize, you don't gatekeep access to it. More people go and build, more people get involved. You get more innovation. Seems to be the case, empirically at least. So that's all good. Thing is, though, none of those things are decentralization. That's not what decentralization is. Decentralization is a means to get some of this stuff. It's not always a means to those ends. Our values, the things that we care about, are prior to decentralization. The things that we care about are censorship resistance, more accessibility, network reliability, computation, innovation. These are the things that we want, right? These are the goals that we're trying to achieve. These are the ends we're trying to optimize for. It turns out that sometimes decentralization is a good mechanism for that, but that's not always the case. It's not decentralization that you want. It's not. It's all the other good stuff that decentralization gives us. That's what matters. The thing about decentralization, I alluded to this at the beginning, it's a cultural thing, right? This is a cultural commitment that we have. This is born from conversations in discords and people making memes and technological decisions that are framed in cultural terms. This is a moral thing. This is a cultural thing. But it's also a technical decision. And we've got this weird sort of cognitive dissonance because we refuse to entertain the prospect that this is actually just a cultural commitment that we have. We think that there are good, solid technical reasons to it. But at the same time, we very rarely enumerate the reasons why decentralization is problematic. We very rarely have legitimate technical conversations about the trade-offs that we make. We accept that it's a technical thing. We try to justify it in technical terms. But at the same time, it's so clearly this cultural commitment that eludes technical evaluation. Once you start to unpick it, once you start to scratch under the surface, the veneer of the decentralization fetish, you realize that it's multidimensional. It's not such a thing as a decentralized system and a non-decentralized system. You have this big spectrum, and that big spectrum sits on 30 different dimensions. Some of them are product-related, some of them are technical, some of them are about the network. We'll talk about some of them in this talk. For whatever dimension you're on, there are ways to be more or less decentralized. And for whatever product you're building, there are lots of dimensions on which you could be more or less decentralized. These are all decisions that you need to make when you're building products. These are decisions that we don't have good cultural vocabulary for evaluating right now in Web3, because decentralization is this fetish. It's a shibboleth. You have to be sufficiently decentralized. If you're not, Twitter will turn on you. So you don't want decentralization because you actually want censorship resistance, and you want more accessibility. You want innovation. You want competition. You don't want decentralization. You also shouldn't want it. It's a trade-off space. There are certain aspects and times in which actually getting decentralization does not give you the things that you actually want any more than alternative approaches would. But in exchange for it, you also pay with a price, and that price is greater user complexity. That price is more difficult user experiences. That price is a whole bunch of technical trade-offs: speed, cost. We know that these things are difficult to do. We know that these are impressive computer science problems because every single year the Ethereum ecosystem manages to leap past them. Every single year the Ethereum Foundation and the best teams in this space manage to make legitimate contributions to how we improve on this stuff. But every single time that we do, we discover that there are more problems, and we don't fix the underlying issues. The user experience story in Ethereum, there was a great panel in this room a couple of hours ago. The user experience in Ethereum story is no better really than it was 5 years ago. There are aspects of it that are, and there are teams that are doing amazing work. I do not wish to denigrate anybody's efforts. There are, but a lot of the reason why it's difficult to get this right is because there are structural reasons. These are basic, fundamental features of a decentralized system that create this problem. I'll be a bit more explicit. We talk about decentralizing front ends a lot, right? Everyone's computation's happening on chain, but the front end isn't, and we try to figure out how we can decentralize front ends. Front ends provide a choke point, an area where we could be vulnerable to censorship or whatever. So, well, the answer is normally, well, IPFS. But has anyone in this room actually tried to run a front end on IPFS? How did it go? Poorly? Yeah, my experience too, yeah. Poorly, right. It's not to say that these aren't challenges that we can get past. We can. I mean, maybe tooling will improve it, but there are structural reasons why. One thing, browsers. People don't have browsers that support IPFS. They don't. Some of us do, because we spend all of our lives on Discord. It's because this matters to us. But if we're trying to build tools for human beings, particularly human beings in countries that have less technical infrastructure, particularly human beings that are using mobiles. Like, how many dApps are not mobile compatible? Do you expect there to be a IPFS compatible mobile browser that everyone uses? We're way before that level of adoption that it's ever going to be possible. So we need to be thinking about those sorts of constraints. The response to that is, of course, you go via a gateway. If you go via a gateway, now you have to go to ipfs.io/some incomprehensible hash, and now you've got a terrible user experience. Again, these are not problems you can't get past, but they are nonetheless problems, and we pretend like they're not. We pretend like they're not because we think decentralization, that's what we want. You also can't run any dynamic code on IPFS. It's a static system. So everything has to go on chain. Or you have to go out to some other API, at which point you've then got some other centralized problem. Do you want a trade-off? I mean, the alternative is just run a bloody EC2 instance. Like that is the alternative in a lot of these cases. It doesn't really give you much more problems. It doesn't protect you more by being on IPFS. Pinning is, of course, the great conceit of IPFS, which is that everyone thinks that it's this global hard drive that you can throw files onto and it will stay there forever. Of course, that's not true. You need to create some sort of incentive mechanism for it. It's a peer-to-peer system. When you download files on BitTorrent, you're also uploading it to other people. Similarly, you need some motivation for someone to be actually serving that file to you. It's a content delivery network. It's more of a competitor to Amazon's CDNs than it is to AWS S3. There are some ways to do that, right? Filecoin. Yeah, Filecoin. I mean, cool, good tech, but you've now just replaced a relatively easy to solve technical problem with a huge operational burden. Alternatively, use Pinata or Fleek. Great tools. They are great tools. They're centralized services. They're great because they've designed to no longer have to deal with the same constraints. That's why they are decent tools. They've wrapped the underlying decentralized technologies and they've created an abstraction layer. They've done what we do when we build products. They've created an abstraction layer above that complexity so we no longer have to deal with it. They've abstracted away from decentralization, become more centralized, and thereby solved the problem. Maybe the tools can get better. Again, maybe they can get better. But for now, this is what we're left with. We're left with either using a centralized system or using a centralized system. The thing is that it's a trade-off space. That's one example. If we look at indexing, the graph, again, the graph do amazing work. It's a really impressive technical achievement. But I really think that they're shooting themselves in the foot a bit by completely getting rid of the hosted service. Because the hosted service is an amazing tool for developers to start using this stuff really well. Companies like Gold Sky and Morales and other teams have noticed that and have jumped into that space. And they will build impressive companies, and they will do a lot to drive Web3 adoption. Why? Because they're not fetishizing decentralization. Instead, they're saying, you know, there's value to having some of these parts of the stack centralized. We don't lose everything. We don't throw the baby away with the bathwater. Never mind. We don't throw the baby away with the bathwater. When we centralize on one dimension, we don't centralize on the rest. And this is the thing, we don't ask questions like this when we have conversations about decentralization. My somewhat cynical suspicion why is because the vast majority of people who make the basic technical decisions, people at the Ethereum Foundation, people who work on Solidity and core pieces of technology, people who work on the protocols that form the primitives of DeFi, these teams are almost always very technical. They're almost always not thinking about the users and the problems and the front end. The product layer is a secondary concern. I get it. If that's not what you're interested in, if that's not what your focus is, then yeah, you're not going to pay attention to it. And even if it was a priority to you, there is a good argument to be made for focusing on this lower end, right? You want to get the primitives right. You want to get the basic infrastructure right. But as a result, people don't ask these questions until it's much too late, until these ideas, this meme of decentralization, this fetish, this shibboleth has been entrenched. Does it allow your users to solve problems more efficiently? I don't think IPFS does. I don't think it ever has. If your user's problem is that they are in an environment that is deeply censorious, and they have to use tools like this, then that's the point at which it's appropriate to make that trade-off. But that's so rarely the case. We're building tools for people across the planet, most of whom don't care on the margin about censorship resistance. Does it add value? You're making technical decisions for cultural reasons, and you're forgetting about the product element to this. Does it add value? Does it create value? Does it allow you to capture more of that value? Most of the time, it doesn't. So, you don't want decentralization. You shouldn't want it. You also don't need it. We've gestured toward this. There are different types of decentralization, different dimensions on which you can be decentralized. The first is computation. A huge amount of computation in Ethereum happens on the EVM in a decentralized way. That's kind of what it is to write a smart contract. It's to push some decentralization there. Of course, the network is also decentralized. The people who not just perform the computation, but those who validate and underwrite it. The network itself and the access to and from it, that's somewhat decentralized. Most people are happy running an Alchemy node or an Infura node. That's somewhat centralized. But it's okay, because the network itself, by design, is decentralized. So that seems fine. The data's decentralized. That seems pretty sure, right? The vast majority of the data sits on-chain. Where the data sits on-chain, then you get some protections there. Product, though. Product's not that decentralized. And I hope I've at least given you some suspicion as to why I think it often doesn't need to be. The thing is that if you have these two, the network and the data, if there is some element of decentralization to them, then you get a huge number of the protections of decentralization. Even if you might have to spin up a new product, or run a different server, or control something when something goes down, or write some monitoring tools to make sure that your server's not broken, or have someone else host it, or use the Liquidity competitive front-end approach. Like, even if there are different things you have to do in order to ensure that your product still continues to run, which, by the way, it's probably going to continue to run because many sites we used way more frequently than anything that anyone in this room has ever built. stay up for 99.9% of the time, and the businesses don't seem to break. So it's not obvious to me that this is a great commercial threat. If you have the network and the data being decentralized, though, and you're going to get that from Ethereum, you inherit those protections from Ethereum. If they are there, then there's very sorts of things that we care about, the accessibility, the combinatorial innovation, a lot of the censorship resistance. That is protected. That's protected by virtue of the fact that the underlying infrastructure is decentralized. Why does that mean that your product has to be decentralized too? Counterfactual decentralization is a thing. The fact that Alchemy runs, 50% or something of the most popular nodes running on front ends, does not mean that Alchemy has monopolistic powers. They cannot price gouge. Why? Because the network is decentralized. Because it's pretty easy to run a competitive hosting platform. That's not that easy. It's still interesting operational challenges, but it's doable. And I know this because there are loads of competitors. People are still okay with going to Alchemy because Alchemy provides a good service and everyone seems to be happy with it, broadly. Infura was there early. They have some brand loyalty and some early adopter effects. But it's possible to run an alternative node hosting platform. If it's possible for someone to do something, to compete with you, to provide the access to the system that you are about to shut off to others, then you are strongly incentivized not to abuse that power. We need to ask, as I conclude, what's going to be driving crypto adoption in the next couple of years? And given how temperamental retail markets can be, and given how vulnerable crypto is to negative narratives around the environment, around scams, we do need to have a conversation about where this is going. And my suspicion is that where this is going is quite a lot more business-to-business integrations, quite a lot more integrations with traditional finance organizations. That tokenization of real-world assets and some of the more interesting use cases, these will inevitably be involved with traditional companies that have traditional legal structures. So there will inevitably be some sort of centralizing power there. We're going to have to get used to the notion that a DAO written by a bunch of degens in their 20s on a protocol with a decentralized front end is not the only model that's going to help grow this ecosystem. Most people are okay with trading off some of those things. I think we should be more explicit about that. And if I'm right about that, if I'm right about the fact that there's going to be quite a lot of value created at the intersection between Web 2 and Web 3, then we have to ask, well, where is that value going to accrue? Well, it's going to accrue to the teams who are able to provide solutions to users' problems in a way that is both value creative and value accruing. And a lot of the time, making the sorts of user experience trade-offs, making some of the commercial and operational difficulties of running a fully decentralized system, those teams who indulge in that decentralization fetish are likely to struggle way more to build a sustainable and defensible business. Because some of these ideas are native to crypto and need to be done in a decentralized way, but most of them aren't. Most of them aren't. Most of them can be copied by people who have fewer scruples about centralizing aspects of their stack and provide a better user experience in return. It's not an optimistic, sunny, happy vision, but I think it's a realistic one. Some practical lessons. First of all, we are free to make centralizing choices for our front ends. Right? If it improves the product, we are free to do that, and we should not make that some sort of violation of a deep cultural norm. We shouldn't perform decentralization because of this monocausal fetish that we have for the notion of a decentralized world. We should be thinking about how are we improving users' lives, how are we solving their problems, and how are we building technology that works and that scales and that's good. Our approach here need be no different from Web 2. It need not be. And I know this, I believe this at least, because Web 2's created trillions of dollars in market value and trillions more in value created that they didn't manage to capture. We can move some computation off-chain. We can use user-identifiable information. You don't need to accept all your payments on-chain. If someone wants to pay $10 a month for a B2B SaaS product, that's also fine. That could work quite well. We can track users, do analytics. Pseudonymity does not give you the guarantee of total privacy. It just means that you don't need to attach a real-world identity to off-world identity. And if using analytics improves your software, improves your user experience, it's not some violation of a decentralization norm to use them. Finally, it's your product. You need to be building this based on what's good, what works for you, what works for the goals that you're trying to optimize for. This is about your product, not about maintaining purity. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Great. Cool.
Great take. Really love the talk. I work in a DAO which has a lot of, there's a lot of legal necessity behind decentralization. And so I'm almost looking at the choices you outlined as like, oh, I wish I could have a centralized product team. And I'm wondering how you view organizations that do have a legal mandate towards decentralization and how you view their choices.
So when you say have a legal mandate toward decentralization, could you...
Strong recommendation towards decentralization from well-paid lawyers.
A well-paid lawyer has said that it would increase your legal and commercial risks were you to be located in one jurisdiction. Is that roughly the...
It's not necessarily being located in one jurisdiction, but it's centralized product development that increases legal risk, particularly for products and protocols that have a token.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. I think that there are probably ways to have centralized elements of centralization, but that's going to depend massively on the idiosyncrasies of how your organization is actually set up. If everyone's self-employed, for instance, or they're running through their own companies, there might be ways to say, okay, well, you know, DevOps Sarah, she's going to run the server, right? That wasn't a particularly inspiring answer, I'm sorry. But let's get coffee afterwards, and it'd be good to chat more.
Well, thanks. I think that is quite important to have someone in the room that is talking against decentralization. I think it's fun, and I believe that it's really difficult for the audience. Like my take on this, or maybe like some reflection, is that I think that it has to be a balance. You know, I think it's really wonderful to have people going really far away with decentralization for the sake of decentralization. But I think that it's extremely important, like you're mentioning, the different layers and different levels of decentralization, and at one point, what are you going to run against, like sure. from censorship, or just towards some place that is like, I don't know, like where are you trying to go? So I think it's kind of it's good to have both things, like both questions, like what should my product be to be fully decentralized, but also which elements of this product should not be decentralized, and be okay with that. So.
Great. Well, I'm glad that message resonated. Like I said, I mean, I probably gave the impression that I loathe decentralization more than I do. There are obviously benefits to it, but I think that there's this sort of groupthink sort of mechanism that prevents us from having these conversations more honestly.
Yeah, that was my second point. Is like, why do you think that this kind of group mentality, or maybe like there are specific parts of the teams in general that tends to fight more for this decentralized for the sake of decentralized, and sure. maybe some other team parts, like for example, I work in UX, we tend to ask questions like this: why are we doing this this way? You know, like asking the question why. Yeah, and I think like maybe you have more view on like what type of profiles or team members are more inclined to this like fight for the sake of decentralization?
No, it's a really good question. So crypto began in 2008 with a sort of libertarian response to banking and centralized control. Its basic memes and basic vision has for a long time been born from a 1990s cyberpunk crypto-libertarian kind of worldview. I think that there's still quite a bit of that has survived. I also think that these things are self-reinforcing. It's quite easy to see the message of decentralization and then become enamored of it. And then even if you're newer to the space and you don't come at it from that political angle, then you nonetheless become a believer. It's exciting. You walk into a room, everyone's talking about freeing the world and creating this better universe free of control. That's a compelling vision. There are politicians that say false things in a good way and manage to get elected, right? So there's a self-reinforcing mechanism to that as well. Or at least when I say false, I didn't mean false. I meant unsubtle things or monodimensional things. And then finally, there's also quite a few people who are, for their own basic interests, just not especially interested in user experience stuff, or not especially interested in product stuff, and consequently are insufficiently respectful of the status that those questions should be rewarded. It just doesn't occur to some people to care about that, right? Like in the same way, I'm not particularly artistic, so it doesn't occur for me to ask about the aesthetic profile of a lot of the objects that I interact with. One of the goals of the book was to raise the relative status of product questions in the Ethereum ecosystem. And yeah, that's again a half answer, but I hope that was. Someone going to disagree really angrily and strongly. I'm excited.
There's time for one more question if someone else.
How would you prevent what happened to Tornado Cash from happening, given that you're advocating for restricted decentralization? I wouldn't say you're advocating for centralization, but sometimes, like, to prevent something like Tornado Cash from happening again, you have to be paranoid, and you have to use the website over IPFS, over Tor, and you have to go through a bad user experience, because sometimes it's just necessary. So how would you?
Sure. So, two things. One, yeah, you're right. Do you always want to prevent things like Tornado Cash from happening? That might not be your job, right? That might not be your company. That might not be the audience for whom you're building. That might not be the worldview that your company's slotting into. You don't have to fight every battle. Crypto people convince themselves they do because we've been this tiny, marginalized little community that's trying to fight for values. We fetishize this stuff. But in the next 5, 10, 20 years, there are going to be a lot of people building companies in crypto that don't have that same resonance with those ideas. The fact that censorship can happen in one direction doesn't always mean that it's your job to fight all of that censorship. There's a practical concerns at play here as well. That's my first point. Secondly, there are ways that you can protect against that. I mean, it happened at the front end level, for sure. But it also happened at plenty of smart contracts. At some point, there are still ways to use technologies that are otherwise going to be censored by pushing them through zero knowledge proof technologies and other privacy guarantees, things like Aztec. There are underlying ways. There are network level approaches that people are going to be experimenting with and building and improving. We'll get there. But in the interim, why are we allowing our products to suffer and massively curtailing the growth of the industry in service of that? This is an either or. We can do both.
Just one more addition to my question. So I agree, if you're not building Tornado Cash, you don't have to be crazy about decentralization. But at the same time, there are a lot of, this is happening quite a lot in our industry, that we have a lot of smart contracts that can be upgraded or changed by one or two people, and users are not aware of it. So there's also the fact that there is centralization for convenience, but it is kind of hidden away from most users. Mm-hmm. So I think that is something that we should maybe, because otherwise, why have smart contracts? Just put your code in, run an API behind a server. It's no different.
Yeah, sort of. Okay, so yeah, fair point. So 2 points then. So number one, there are benefits to smart contracts beyond just decentralization. So having a native representation of value transferal, and then that being this shareable, composable thing, is quite powerful. So that's good. And we wouldn't really have that. Like we'd have to get the Collison brothers to run the world economy in order for that to work with the same level of flexibility that it does. So for what it's worth, I think if the Colossus around the world economy, we might all be better off. But anyway, there are benefits to smart contracts beyond just decentralization, and we do still get them, even if we decide to centralize other aspects of the stack. That's the first point. And then finally, I'm sorry, the thoughts just dropped out of my head. But let's definitely chat afterwards. But no, I completely appreciate your skepticism. These are really good questions to have, and this is the conversation I wanted to happen. It's the fact that we don't have this conversation very often that's the frustrating thing, not that everyone else disagrees with me.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.